Welcome to Shooting Straight with A1F.com. I'm Frank Miniter, the editor-in-chief of the NRA's America's First Freedom. Today we have the incredible pleasure of speaking with Amy Swearer, a legal fellow with the Heritage Foundation. Now, Amy, I've wanted to talk to you for a long time. You do so much on the Second Amendment, and you speak a lot of congressional hearings and in various states, for various states committees. And you mostly speak about laws having to do something with the Second Amendment, and you tend to articulate it so well. The first one that jumps to mind with me is there had been a shootout in Chicago in October of 21 where 5 people were arrested, 5 gang members, I think 70 something shell casings found on the ground. And so they were arrested. And then the local district attorney, Kim Fox, just let them out with no charges because she considered it to be mutual combat. Now that isn't a defense I'd ever heard, especially from a district attorney before. And then you note that at a Senate hearing, and Senator Dick Durbin tries to shut you down because the district attorney who did this horrendous thing, let these people back onto the streets with no charges, wasn't there to defend herself. You must have been just appalled and shocked that a senator would try to shut you down for noting something so important.
Well, right. So the hearing you're referring to was actually a hearing specifically in Chicago about gun violence in Chicago. So you would think that decisions made by those public actors in Chicago would be entirely relevant, and that if, say, Dick Durbin or any other senator wanted to bring in those individuals to defend themselves, well, they absolutely had the opportunity to do it. But you see here just sort of the lengths that some anti-gun policymakers will go to sort of keep the truth suppressed, with any means necessary, keep people on the other side from pointing to the actual problems, because in their minds, it has to be guns, right? If the problem isn't guns or it's not a lack of gun control, well, then what could it possibly be? And they don't want the answer to that because a lot of times it comes back down to other policies that, they don't fit well onto a slogan, right? It's a lot harder to point at a more complex issue than it is to just say, oh, well, it's guns, it's guns, it's guns. But they don't want to hear that. And so, again, I think you just see the lengths that they will go to. And it's also a bit ironic because having sat through enough of these congressional hearings, this idea of, oh, well, if someone isn't there to defend themselves, then, we just can't talk about what the actual problem is. Let me tell you the number of times that even people within hearings will be spoken around, right, or accused of things, myself included, without the opportunity to respond even when they're there. That's just simply how congressional hearings work. We are there with expert witnesses to discuss the actual issues, and it's just, again, it's almost laughable, but that's the lengths that they will go to.
Well, I don't think most people realize just how choreographed those hearings are. I remember when I'd first gone them, I've never testified before Congress, but I've sat at that press table many, many times. And I remember being surprised, and I'm still surprised, that each speaker generally gets 5 minutes. Someone presenting comes in to testify, gets 5 minutes. And then different members on a committee each get 5 minutes. It goes back and forth between parties. And it promotes grandstanding and trying to especially for the members of Congress, to try to get their little soundbite on national news that night. It doesn't really keep a dialogue going and get to the truth, but somehow you're able to bring so much out despite only having those 5 minutes.
Yeah, there's almost a sense in which you have to almost anticipate that 5 minutes of opening remarks that you get will be the most important and potentially even the only 5 minutes that you get during this entire hearing as an expert witness to actually talk about the area of your expertise. Because there have unfortunately been entire hearings where you go through them and I'm like, I think you got asked a question once or twice, and it's in the form of a yes or no. But I think you're correct. A lot of times the purpose of these hearings, and I think it's unfortunate, but the purpose becomes more about grandstanding than it is about actually discovering information or opening up that conversation with expert witnesses on either side. But certainly for my purposes, I'm there to rebut and refute anti-gun, anti-Second Amendment talking points. So it is a
Well,
bit unfortunate, but I understand that's how the game is played.
one of the members of Congress, I think it was last March, hearing on the ATF, did give you a second to respond because they were over and over again insinuating or like outright saying that guns just harm women and women then can't protect themselves with firearms. And you were given a chance to reply to that.
I was, and thank goodness for Congresswoman Luna. So several times, predominantly male members of the Democratic side, just over and over again, this refrain of, and see, that's why guns don't protect women. And I was seething, right? Because this isn't like a cage match, right? Where if they throw a punch, you get to throw one back. You generally only get to respond if you're given that opportunity. And so to hear that 3 or 4 different times and not have that, I'd like to joke, I was trying to telecommunicate with anybody, give me that 30 seconds to respond. And fortunately, Congresswoman Luna, um, it, I think she understood there was an opportunity for her and I as women to address this. And, she lobbed up that softball for me to essentially respond to this idea of guns not protecting women. And I appreciate that, because the reality is guns are, especially for women, so important. They don't stop becoming important for self-defense just because someone doesn't have a Y chromosome. In fact, they become more important. This natural right of self-defense includes women. And for women who are generally, just as a matter of biology, undersized compared to men and maybe at a physical disadvantage, it's self-defense at a distance. It gives us a measure of equalization in our own self-defense. And it's so incredibly important. If you look at some of the work I do at the Heritage Foundation with the defensive gun use database, you'll see time and time again how important it is for women to defend themselves from whether it's domestic violence abusers or random armed robbers. This happens all the time, where women who are armed are capable of defending themselves. And I think I'll say again, as I said then, I did not appreciate having my natural unalienable rights mansplained to me by a bunch of senators, or I guess in that case, members of the House of Representatives, who go in every day surrounded by armed security, who members of that armed security force actually had to come into that hearing to help protect us from rabble-rousers, from protesters that day. That's something they take for granted. And I don't think any woman or any other American, any human being, should stand for having people who have that armed self-defense paid for by taxpayers every day, sitting around and trying to turn it back on us and saying, well, it's important for us, but you guys, well, it doesn't protect you, as though somehow that gun stops being important when it's not funded by taxpayers.
Right. And I think you actually used the word offensive. And then I would love to have seen the expressions on their faces when you accused them of mansplaining, which they certainly were doing. What a moment that truth came through. And thank you for doing that. We did print that in America's First Freedom, as we often do when you do this stuff. And your latest feature with us is on the reasons behind the crime wave, the stuff the mainstream media just really doesn't want to get into and tell people why this is going on and how this is going on. So can you go through some of those points? As you investigated this, what are you finding? Why is the crime wave happening?
Well, I think part of it was this perfect storm, right? So I don't think it's fair at any point ever to suggest that there's just this one quick, easy solution or this one simple factor underlying crime, because crime is far too complex. But I think when you look at when this crime spike happens, it starts in the middle of the summer of 2020. Now, what starts happening in the middle of the summer of 2020? Well, a couple of very important and fundamentally sort of nation-altering events, right? So you have widespread civil unrest hitting a lot of major cities around the country, and that starts diverting police resources. And it's about this sort of anti-policing sentiment to begin with. You have that coinciding with the height of COVID lockdowns, right, where police ranks across the country are being decimated. There was a point where something like 25% of NYPD was out on sick leave, right? So you have all of that coalescing with this ongoing problem of what we call at Heritage rogue prosecutors. That is, prosecutors who are essentially non-prosecutors, who don't take crime seriously, who do things like, when police do arrest perpetrators of violent crimes, like we talked about in Chicago, just release them for absurd reasons in the name of criminal justice reform. And it is reform, but it's reform in the wrong direction. And so when you have all of this combining together, you sort of lose this trust in police. You lose the ability of police forces to do their job adequately. And you're also then releasing back into the community the small subset of violent offenders who we know statistically are disproportionately responsible for those crimes. And when you put all of that together, well, you sort of create the perfect conditions for a widespread crime wave that gets out of control. And I think, fortunately, you're starting to see in some cities the tide being stemmed a little bit. But I think this is unfortunately an issue that we are going to have to continue dealing with as a country and reeling that back in for years to come. And in the meantime, I think the answer is not to disarm law-abiding, peaceable citizens in the name of combating gun violence when those are not the individuals who are statistically committing those crimes to begin with. It's actually the opposite. It's allowing peaceable citizens to be able to adequately defend themselves, while at the same time, when we do catch and arrest those again, that small subset of violent offenders, don't let them back out into the public. The easiest way to prevent them from getting an illegal firearm, because again, they are statistically already prohibited from legally purchasing and possessing those guns, the easiest way to prevent them from getting around that law is to detain them, to keep them in prison where they cannot harm other innocent law-abiding citizens. And until we start focusing on that as a country, and as long as we keep focusing on law-abiding, peaceable citizens, we're going to, unfortunately, continue seeing this be a problem.
Yeah, that's the one statistic that surprised me a lot. It's not looked into enough, that it's a very small number of very violent people in most of these areas that are doing most of the crimes. And if you arrest that small number of people, a couple of thousand in New York City, it's been said before and so on, if you just arrest those couple of thousand people and actually prosecute them for crimes they've been caught committing, that crime rates are much more likely to go down. Instead, we have a president, President Joe Biden, who is blaming the lawful gun owner, the average gun owner, and guns in general for this crime increase. I mean, statistically, I don't imagine you're finding any truth in that claim whatsoever.
No, absolutely not. And the reality, too, is when you have someone who is a violent offender, it really doesn't matter what type of firearm they have, right? It doesn't matter whether it's a handgun, whether it's a rifle, whether that rifle has a pistol grip or a barrel shroud or is 16 inches or 14.5 inches or 20 inches in barrel length. They're going to do a lot of damage with that firearm. Because again, in a lot of these crimes, these violent crimes, people are not actually being shot. And when they are being shot, it's not coming down to whether it was a handgun or a pistol grip or anything of that nature. The reality is, when these individuals who are dangerous have any firearm, or when they have a knife, when they have a butcher's knife or an axe, it doesn't matter. They are capable of committing those same crimes, and they are apparently quite willing to continue committing those same crimes. So the focus ought to be on those specific individuals and not even necessarily limiting them to a particular type of violence. It should be keeping them from violence, period. And we will all be much better off, much safer as communities and as a nation when those individuals are treated like the violent offenders that they are, and we take their violent crimes serious.
Well, given this at some point comes down to voters, they have to vote some of these people out. And then given that we have such political activists with bylines in much of our mainstream media, I mean, do you see any hope of us getting, I know you do a lot of heritage for it, we do a lot at the NRA to try to get this word out, but do you see any hope of this really reaching mainstream America enough where they'll vote these people out and bring us back to law and order?
Well, I would like to hope so. This is something that, as you mentioned, both me and my colleagues at the Heritage Foundation are trying to get the word out. And in some sense, I view my job as being a teacher. I tell people my mom got the last laugh. She always said, "Oh, you'd be a great teacher." I'm like, "I'm never doing that." But in reality, that's what our jobs are, is to help teach Americans what the actual problems are, to help them think through what's going wrong and how we fix it. And so I think you're right. Until the bulk of Americans in these jurisdictions, like Chicago or Philadelphia or Los Angeles, New York City, until they start understanding that the problems stem from things that they can control, their elected officials and the policy decisions being made by those elected officials, until they understand that and actually stand up and use the democratic process to fix that, then we're just going to continue seeing a lot of these same problems. And that's unfortunate. Again, crime and criminal justice are inherently local problems. There's not a lot that I can do as not a resident of Chicago to fix what's wrong in Chicago, other than to help those in that situation to understand that the problems are actually, to some extent, within their control through their vote.
Right. I've had some very interesting discussions at that press table and a lot of congressional hearings with the reporters around me, with the Washington Post and AP and all this kind of stuff, to get their worldview and point of view. And as I would speak to them, and I find it astounding typically, um, their unwillingness to actually print the whole story and dive into the truth. Instead, they're on this bent to push a certain political correctness and stay according to a certain politics. And I never really saw an opening where they would have to. I remember even in the Fast and Furious hearings, which I attended all those, wrote a lot about them. They just were not going to tell the whole story.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, and I think that's where it comes down to people like yourself and myself and our colleagues and other just average Americans. This doesn't have to be your permanent paid job in order to, have that little bit of skepticism about what you hear, to investigate it further, and to continually look for that truth. And then when you find it, right, when you find the full answer, to be able to then tell other people about it. In many respects, the gun policy debate is a very grassroots issue, because the national media, and to some extent even the local media, is so already consumed with this narrative of what the problem is. But unfortunately, that narrative is false, or at least, at the very least, half-hearted. It only tells that half side of the truth. And unfortunately, that other half is so important, that it's not just about guns, it's about who has those guns. And in this case, the actual danger is, again, that small subset of repeat offenders who are using not lawfully possessed guns, but unlawfully obtained guns that they got through the black market, and that it doesn't matter what type of guns they have. So until we tell that full narrative and continue telling that full narrative, you're right, it just sort of gets lost in this sort of national narrative that is just patently incorrect.
Amy, I've always found you to be a truth teller, and I'm a big fan of your work and all you do for us and for Heritage. So where could people go to follow you, find you, read your stuff?
Well, you can always follow me on Twitter at Amy Swearer, or at Heritage, to see what I and my colleagues are doing. Or you can follow us at heritage.org, or our multimedia arm, thedailysignal.com.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me.